Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the organizer, the Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights of Internally Displaced Persons and the Platform on Disaster Displacement, we are very happy to welcome you to this side event on the thematic report of the Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights of Internally Displaced Persons to the Third Committee of the UN General Assembly at its 75th session. We have a very dense program. And it's my honor to introduce you to the moderator of this event, Mr. William Chemali, Global Protection Cluster Coordinator. William, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Atle. Colleagues, excellencies, ladies, gentlemen, friends. I greet you today in 7 languages, those of our panelists for the event. So I say Bula, as we say in Fiji, and Magandang Umaga, as we say in Philippines, Lokwe Kom from the Marshall Islands, Kamaihi from Alaska, Assalamu Alaikum from Chad and South Sudan, and Muli Mutia from Uganda, and last but not least, Halu from Norway. On behalf of the organizers, I welcome you to this side event on the thematic report of the Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights of Internally Displaced Persons to the Third Committee of the UN General Assembly. My name is William Chemali, and I coordinate a global network of NGOs and UN agencies that operate in over 30 contexts of conflict and disasters. And I have the pleasure to moderate the session today. In many parts of the world, people are uprooted or at the risk of being uprooted from their homes, schools, way of living, livelihoods, and traditions due to the adverse effect of climate change. And the Special Rapporteur has written an important piece on this topic that we want to present today. Through the very dynamic panel, the objective of the session today is to really dive deeper into the reality through the lens of the thematic report of the Special Rapporteur. And first, we want to reflect on the findings in this report. Second, we will hear about specific risks faced by communities, countries, and affected people represented on the panel. And finally, we will give ideas and further recommendations that can be taken up by the UN Secretary General High-Level Panel on IDPs. To have a fruitful conversation, I do call on the panelists to concentrate their big passion, knowledge, and messages in 10 minutes slots allocated to them. This way we can spread the knowledge throughout the event and listen to all the perspectives. So to kick us off and frame our discussion, I would like to invite climate change champion, dare I say, His Excellency Ambassador Dr. Satyendra Prasad from the Permanent Mission of Fiji to the UN in New York. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, William, moderator. And good afternoon, good evening to all of you. Good morning, and to colleagues logging in from around the world. Madam Cecilia, Jimenez-Damary, Special Rapporteur on Human Rights for Internally Displaced People, permanent representatives of Marshall Islands and other countries, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, fellow panelists. Very pleased to set our discussions up this morning. The recent Internal Displacement Monitoring Center's global report on internal displacement notes that nearly 1,900 disasters have triggered 24.9 million new displacements across 140 countries in 2019 alone. And that's quite a considerable figure. For the Pacific region, the IDMC estimates for the last 10 years, ending 2018, nearly 250,000 displacements have occurred in 5 small island states alone. They are Fiji, Marshall Islands, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, and Tonga. Disaster displacement is ever increasing with more intensity, with more frequency, and climate change is most likely going to aggravate all of these tendencies. Therefore, the human rights implications and the need to ensure that human rights of displaced people are protected when they are moved is already a grave challenge before us, and its gravity will only intensify over time with the current trend lines. We are grateful that this is the first time that, given the particular challenges of internal displacement in the context of slow onset adverse effects of climate change, we have a report on this important subject matter that is being presented before the UN General Assembly by the Special Rapporteur that we are discussing today. Not only is the report being presented to the UN General Assembly, but this webinar also provides us with an opportunity to reflect on our own country situations and regional situations about the challenges and the implications and the potential solutions that we can bring to the table to redress, to improve the protection of displaced people. The World Risk Report of 2019 has 4 countries from the Pacific in the top 15 countries as under very high risk from natural disasters. Vanuatu is ranked number 1 in this. Tonga is ranked number 3. Solomon Islands at 4 and Fiji at 12. As a highly vulnerable and exposed region, we have placed human rights at the heart of our government's work and the focus of regional discussions in climate change and disaster displacement. Some of the highlights of this are that the 2050 strategy of the Blue Pacific continent. Our Pacific leaders have endorsed the development of a 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific continent. They acknowledge the need for urgent, immediate actions on the threat and challenges of climate change facing the Blue Pacific, and they realize that the health and well-being and safety and security and human rights of Pacific Islanders are contingent on addressing this. The Kainaki 2 declaration calls for urgent climate action. Now, leaders have discussed and agreed that climate change is a real threat. They have agreed by consensus that this requires urgent action, and they place absolute priority on climate action to achieve the Paris Agreement. Fiji has further joined the Geneva Pledge on Human Rights and Climate Change to ensure that human rights is integrated in our climate actions. And one of the core pillars of Fiji displacement and relocation guidelines is on having a human right-based approach. A human rights-based approach that is aligned to the Paris Agreement, and an approach that becomes more present in positioning rights close to the mobility process. At the regional level, the Pacific is collaborating on a project called Enhancing Protection and Empowerment of Migrants and Communities Affected by Climate Change and Disasters in the Pacific region. This has received funding from UN Trust Fund for Human Security and will operate in Fiji, Kiribati, Tuvalu, Republic of Marshall Islands, and Vanuatu. The project is jointly implemented by IOM, UNHCR, and PDD, and we really welcome this, and we look forward to a very successful conclusion. Fiji will continue to support the work of the platform on PDD and ensure that we represent other Pacific islands in this important forum and highlight concerns and lessons learned, and best practice from the region can be shared across the platform. We will ensure that we work with the IOM and UNHCR through the PDD to ensure coherence in addressing disaster displacement issues across the Pacific region. I really look forward to the presentation of the Special Rapporteur's report and its finding. I encourage us to engage in a constructive dialogue on what needs to be done to address the challenges and how we can bring better shape our country recommendations. We look forward to a very fruitful discussions this morning, afternoon, and hope that we can build on some of your ideas to support another thread of work under the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on internal displacement. Thank you very much, and good luck in the deliberations.
Thank you, Ambassador. This was a great overview. Thanks for it and for the leadership. that Fiji presents in this important area of work. Now, let me turn to the Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights of IDPs, Ms. Cecilia Jimenez-Damary, for her presentation. Cecilia, the floor is yours. Cecilia, I have to use the sentence of the year. You have to unmute.
There you go. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. And thank you so much, William, for the moderation. Also thanking PDD for co-organizing with my mandate this panel of very prestigious panelists. So thank you so much to everybody who are here. It's really my pleasure to introduce to you the report that I will be presenting tomorrow at the third committee of the General Assembly concerning climate change, slow onset adverse effects of climate change and internal displacement. Internal displacement has definitely been linked to adverse effects of climate change, and it is expected to increase significantly over the coming years and decades. And projections indicate that without climate change and development action, over 143 million could be forced to move within their own countries by 2050, owing to slow onset impacts of climate change. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is merely an underestimation. While this figure covers different types of human mobility, it gives an indication of the expected scale of movement in these regions, in many regions, which suggests that the global scale will be even higher. Climate change affects and will affect every region in the world, although some countries and communities are more vulnerable, including small island developing states and the least developed countries. Most population movements relating to slow onset adverse effects of climate change are actually expected to remain within national borders. The report that I am sharing with you today and that I will be formally presenting to the General Assembly tomorrow draws attention to the particular challenges posed by internal displacement in the context of the slow onset adverse effects of climate change and its impact on the enjoyment of human rights of those affected. And the aim is advancing what already the ambassador from Fiji has flagged, advancing a human rights-based approach to prevention, response, and solutions. In fact, the adverse effects of climate change can involve slow and sudden onset events, but this report focuses on slow onset events which have been defined as events that evolve gradually from incremental changes occurring over many years, or from an increased frequency or intensity of recurring events. And these slow onset events include what we are already experiencing: sea level rise, increasing temperatures, ocean acidification, glacial retreat and related impacts, salinization, land and forest degradation, as well as loss of biodiversity and desertification. There is, of course, an extensive evidence of the widespread impacts of climate change on the enjoyment of human rights, such as the rights to life, health, housing, food and water, education, cultural rights, and collective rights, and including the rights of indigenous peoples and the right to self-determination. And many states, around 150 states, have already recognized in their law the human right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment in all parts of life. Those impacts contribute to displacement, and displacement further impacts the enjoyment of human rights. And therefore, under the 1998 Guiding Principles on Internal Displacement, which reflect international human rights law and international humanitarian law, arbitrary displacement is prohibited, including in the case of disasters, unless the safety and health of those affected requires their evacuation. My main message at this particular point in my presentation is to ensure not only a focus on human rights, but to focus as well on the mainstreaming of human rights in all other international legal regimes, including international environmental law. And also, it is also very important for us to recognize that the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is very relevant in this regard. Understanding internal displacement in the context of slow onset adverse effects of climate change is very complicated. And when we look at movement patterns, human mobility in the context of slow onset adverse effects of climate change can actually take many forms, including displacement, migration, and planned relocation. In most cases, movement is not entirely voluntary or forced, but rather falls somewhere on the continuum between the two, with different degrees of voluntariness or constraint. In line with the definition of the guiding principles on internal displacement is considered to take place when people are evacuated or flee their homes, whether to avoid the anticipated effects of a disaster, in the aftermath of a disaster, and remaining within the country's disasters, or are obliged without that characteristic of being forced. So this is a very important aspect to really realize that in slow onset adverse effect of climate change, yes, there are internally displaced persons. As climate change affects different areas in varied ways, human mobility patterns, therefore, including displacement, are very context specific. And the way in which different parts of the world are affected by natural hazard varies depending on many factors relating to their geography and climate. And attached to this is that the level of vulnerability of individuals and households plays an important role in their mobility, and as well in the risk of the violation of their human rights. My report also looks at the interrelationship between slow onset adverse effects of climate change and armed conflict, which is actually in many parts of the world. Now, let me go to the issue of data and evidence very quickly. And I would like to emphasize in the sharing of my report with all of you that reliable data and evidence on internal displacement are essential to inform policy and operational responses. This includes early warning, disaster risk management, and preparedness in order to understand protection needs and support durable solutions. Academic research is also important because it provides valuable information to inform effective laws and policies within this context. Last point that I would like to emphasize in this presentation is actually the impacts on the enjoyment of human rights by IDPs, including specific groups. The impacts on the enjoyment of human rights can actually be experienced differently depending on the vulnerability of specific groups. And they are extensive. They start with the right to freedom of movement, the choice of place of residence. And when people are displaced, they lose many things. They lose dignity, they lose their identity, and may even lose part of their cultural and collective identity, particularly when we're talking about indigenous peoples and communities. So what I'm saying is that while climate change is global and its adverse effects and related mobility affect people differently, slow onset processes and related displacement also intersect with gender, age, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, cultural background, and disability, resulting in differentiated impacts on different groups and exacerbating pre-existing inequalities and vulnerabilities. I would like to end this short presentation of 10 minutes by saying that such vulnerable groups, however, we must look at them as also agents of positive change. And even though specific groups are particularly vulnerable to slow onset adverse effects of climate change and related displacement, they also have great agency. In many contexts, they display remarkable strength resourcefulness and resilience in the face of disasters and displacement. And this is also why I am very happy that we have an IDP who has experienced this situation, that despite the challenges, barriers, and discrimination that they face, they actually are not only resilient, but they are actually try to do their best individually, as a family, and collectively to actually resolve aspects of their displacement. Lastly, and finally, my report provides many recommendations to states in terms of prevention and preparedness, as well as protection and assistance and durable solutions. And my main recommendations to UN member states is that it is important to realize that we need to actually address climate change, and specifically internal displacement and the effects of slow onset climate change in a holistic manner, looking at the level of prevention, protection and assistance, and durable solutions. And this, of course, includes everybody in our way of dealing with things, including businesses and national institutions. Addressing the problem, the phenomenon, requires a holistic approach to the complexity and multi-causality of human mobility in such contexts. And it requires joint action by affected states and the international community, the civil society, the citizenry, and of course, the internally displaced persons themselves and all affected populations. Thank you very much for this opportunity to present to you the report initially.
Thank you very much, Cecilia, for this comprehensive overview. As you said, yes, they are internally displaced people. And yes, they have remarkable strength and resilience. And yes, they need a comprehensive set of support. And the call you have specified to member states and different actors are spot on and very welcome. To hear from a member state's perspective, I would like to turn to the Marshall Islands, who is recognized as an international climate change champion. The Marshall Islands is currently the convener and host of the Secretariat of the High Ambition Coalition that is credited to the 1.5 degree temperature goal in the Paris Agreement. On behalf of the Marshall Islands, I would like to call on Her Excellency Ambassador Amatlain Kabua from the Permanent Mission of the Marshall Islands to the UN in New York. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Loud and clear. Please
Okay.
go ahead.
Okay. Mr. Moderator, thank you really for this opportunity to share with you an island perspective on issue of internal displacement and climate change. I also like to commend you on your linguistic talent. You really know how to already speak my language. But on the outset, the Republic of the Marshall Islands welcomes and appreciate your focus on the relationship between internal displacement and climate change. Coming from a low-lying island nation with no higher ground, these issues are front and center of our risk profile and will for sure produce complex challenges in the future. But we also acknowledge these are shared threats faced by different peoples and regions on a global basis. So while we all have unique geographies and cultures, we are also here to focus on common challenges. I strongly welcome the Rapporteur's recent report regarding human rights, slow onset climate impact, and internal displacement. I can provide some perspective from my small island lens, but also with a view towards wider multilateral obligation. While it is perhaps an obvious statement, it is nonetheless must be stated that most effective means to avoid or minimize this right situation is to achieve higher ambition in global emission reduction efforts. This issue is already as a home under the Paris Agreement, but it is nonetheless must remind us of the importance of action. Likewise, reducing vulnerability through effective adaptation and disaster risk reduction measures is also an obligation which would sharply reduce future human rights impact. So while we already have places to address this issue within the UNGA and under the UNFCCC, the message is straightforward and common sense. Action should reduce climate impacts, would also reduce human rights issues, including internal displacement. So I seek to focus on 3 key points. First, it is important to acknowledge the recommendation for a multi-sectorial approach to the issue of internal displacement. Second, in addressing the finding that is a national human rights obligation to take risk reduction measures, I need to emphasize the wide gap between paper policies and visible results achieved through implementation. Third, it is also important to reflect upon the unique social and cultural challenges posed by internal displacement, in particular within the Pacific Island region, as was alluded and stated by Majier and my dear brother, Prasad from Fiji. As an atoll nation, our geography consists of thin, narrow strip of land with no higher ground, as you've seen in the pictures that were provided. Our atolls are separated by vast ocean water. Sometimes we're known as the ocean continent. So the risk posed by slow onset climate effects, in particular sea level rise, are obvious. While we do not frequently experience large scale single events like typhoon, we do have high frequency repetitive coastal flooding. And while it is outside of the immediate topic of internal migration, we also have serious external migration challenges. In terms of slow onset climate effects and internal migration, not all geographies within a low-lying island nation are equally vulnerable. Some communities live in areas of relative higher vulnerability with settlement pattern driven by both environmental and social factors. We already have a range of internal displacement and internal migration issues, including in relation to growing population center with over more modern services unavailable in remote outer island communities. Another core issue is internal displacement is local communities and people who are affected by extensive nuclear testing conducted between 1946 and 1958 during our time as a UN trusteeship. So I emphasize the report's recommendation that climate-driven internal displacement cannot be viewed only by silos, and that a multi-sectorial approach is needed. We have to take into account a wider range of factors, including security, gender, economics, environment, and social development. I can also point out that SIDS have smaller governments. It is perhaps often a little easier for us to reach across different sectors. I also affirm the report's finding that it is a national human right obligation to pursue disaster risk reduction measures and other action which reduce vulnerability to climate-driven impacts. Here we also need to recognize other challenges in turning paper policies or laws into visible local action. I think that too often in New York or in Geneva, we look at laws and policy documents from a great distance and assume that once they are written, they will become reality. That simply isn't true for a variety of reasons. There are some well-known discussions on access to finance and capacity, and there are also issues, there are other issues. For the Marshall Island, adaptation to slow onset climate impact present some very complicated policy issues for my country that often struggle to successfully implement basic undertaking. So from a human rights perspective, we shouldn't assume that the most vulnerable population are actually well protected just because a law or written policy is in hand, but we actually need to track full implementation to measure effectiveness. Finally, climate-driven internal displacement is also a culturally complex issue. In our traditional culture, people belong to specific land as part of their personal and social identity. And this identity lasts for generations. So when we physically move from one atoll to another, we still culturally belong to our own home atoll. Similar to challenges we already know from our experience with displacement and nuclear testing, slow onset climate impact like sea level rise present a situation in which there may not be habitable land for eventual return. Thus, these displaced communities are at risk of becoming a sort of nomad in their own country, in which they have lost a cultural part of themselves. Further, these displaced communities are often considered only as guests of their new host communities. They may often end up in resettling in the least desirable part of the islands, which are also more vulnerable than others to coastal flooding or other impacts. So while a displaced community can find a new home, they are never really able to be considered it as a true home. In 2012, the Marshall Islands hosted the Special Rapporteur for Hazardous Waste and later committed to undertake a broad consultative process with stakeholders, with particular emphasis on solutions aimed at reconciling the traditional land tenure system with durable solutions to displacement. This issue deserves further attention. So particularly in the Pacific Island region, but also a relevant lesson elsewhere in the world, is the realization that slow onset climate impact like sea level rise also raise very complex cultural and social challenges. After all, who are you and what do you do when your place that you belong to is also literally a place to which you can't return? In closing, I wish to thank the Special Rapporteur for a report to the General Assembly, as well as all the co-sponsor and organizer of this event for providing space for an island perspective. I like to say, seeing is believing. So I hope that you are all able to come and visit the Marshall Islands. You're most welcome. So please come and visit us and see the reality on the ground. Thank you so much. We say "Komol Tata" in my country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and thanks for the open invitation. And thanks for this reminder that in Geneva and New York, we look at documents and policies with great distance, and they don't often materialize on the ground. And with this in mind, I would like to turn to someone on the ground, Mr. Joseph Majier, Akkot, who is with us today, joining. Joseph was born in Yei in South Sudan in 1990s. And he has gone through the conflict that has affected his country for many years and took from him members of the family and members of his relatives. Joseph is settled in Mahad camp in Juba, where they have lived since 2016. And he's married, he has 2 kids. Talking about agency, resilience, and strength, Joseph is volunteering for his community as secretary to the camp chairperson. Joseph will give us some highlights today from his daily life. And I hope you can hear me well, Joseph. And would like to hear from you how you see climate change and its adverse impact has affected your life, and any of the recommendations that you have for us here on the call. Joseph, the floor is yours.
Yes, good morning and good evening. I would like to share with the climate change and internal displaced person. So I will be in Yei, and then I came to Juba So climate change, they are affected all our IDPs and displaced persons. So today I'm very happy also to share climate change with you. And we are in the Mat IDPs camp within Juba. We have a lot of challenges. The little food we got in the Mat IDPs camp, and the population also, they came, the flood displaced person from different locations like Jonglei and other areas. The food is very limited to the IDPs. So we need support to support the IDPs. So and internal displaced person within Juba. Also, we have a flood displaced person from Jonglei. They came also. We have a lot of challenges now. We don't have any water, clean drinking water, and then we don't have also shelters, and with is limited to the IDPs. And then we've been here. So the conflict between IDPs in Mat IDPs camp, the conflict between host community and the IDPs also. So the for hygiene and sanitation. So also we have challenges to relate in COVID-19. So all the challenges we got here. So also in the impact of climate change here. So a crop and house and it's sheltered in the water also, lack of access of market. When you move alongside the road, there's no the place where we've been support the people of climate change. If you look outside, like when you go to Bo and you came to Juba, so no way. And we have also the lack of access and humanitarian support. So also in access of road. Also, when people that move, like you go within town to other place, there's no way the people will be moving. Like it is a displaced person, a blood displaced person in Mangala. When you look, the people there I stay in the school, there is no place. The people there I stay, they stay along the tree, no shelter, no everything. So just we need to support. If you have any support, you can support all the IDPs. We have nothing like internal displaced person location in urban Juba. Like when you move around the town in Juba, you find the people in different locations like Mangoten and Mat IDPs camp, and then also Don Bosco, and then we have Juba 2 and Jabal camp, and also we have Gumbo and Chirkat, and then also we have Jabal Dinka 1 and 2 and 3 and Kapuri, and then also we have Korojik, and the total of the population in Mangala also is reach. It reached like 1,000 of people, like I record there. So we need any support. All the center around urban Juba, and then we have nothing. And the food we got to World Food Program, so it's little. It can not help us. And the challenge is also to displace person, the population, like for health, like no medicine to give to the IDPs, and the people they are dying in malaria, and lack of drinking water, no clean water, and the people they are suffering a lot. And also we have overcrowding in the place and the school in the school. So all that challenges we've been faced here, and then we requesting you also to help us. And human right abuse and etc. raping. and the loss of job also, and it is overbreaking, like here in Juba. So we've been suffering a lot, and then we need and support to help the IDPs. Also, we have a state responsibility in relation to the climate change, like easily awareness system and disaster management within Juba, and content planning also, and the communities. So all those things we need you, we're requesting you. We are the IDPs, we've been suffering a lot. So that is the report I have also. Also, I have a recommendation, raise awareness to the IDPs and the climate change, and share other humanitarian assistance and improvement of the road network and development fund. Also, we've been requesting all those things to support the IDPs within around Juba. So that is my recommendation. I told you, and Almighty God be with you all. Thank you so much.
Joseph, shukran jazilan. Thank you so much for this honest reality check for all of us on this description of this crippling vicious circle, from poverty to water to overcrowding to dropout from school to loss of jobs and human rights issues. And it is, as Ambassador said before, easy for us to go in silos, where the description coming from you is clearly showing how the issue of climate change and its negative effects is infrastructurally hitting every aspect of their lives in terms of displacement, what you're seeing in South Sudan. So thanks a lot for this honest description. I would like to move to another frontline of climate change, Alaska. I would like to introduce Ms. Robin Bronen. Robin, many people working on climate change calls her immediately my friend. She has been working as a human rights attorney and interdisciplinary social scientist on the issue of climate forced displacement of Alaska Native communities since 2007. She's well-recognized global expert with many awards and clear, loud voice and targeted voice in terms of media and global advocacy presence. Robin, I would like to hear from you, how is climate change affecting the Arctic ecosystem and the lives of the local communities? Is it, and how is it driving displacement in the area? And from your experience, where are the recommendations from the report that you would like to reinforce? And are there any additional thoughts that you would like to present? So Ms. Robin Bronen, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to present what is happening in the Arctic. Thank you to the Special Rapporteur for her excellent report, and to your excellencies for describing the situation that is happening in the South Pacific, and to Joseph for sharing your experience as an IDP in South Sudan. So I come to you from Alaska, which is warming at twice the rate as the lower latitudes. And honestly, I'm heartbroken. I've had the opportunity to speak at these venues many times, and you know, the Arctic is melting faster than we are reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So the Arctic is warming at 3.5 degrees Celsius during the wintertime, which you know is far beyond the aspirational guidelines of the Paris Agreement. And that warming is causing Arctic sea ice to disappear. So since 1979, Arctic sea ice extent has reduced by 40%. They are expecting Arctic sea ice to be non-existent in the Arctic Ocean before 2030. And while the loss of Arctic sea ice extent will be dramatic for the entire world because it is our air conditioning unit, and researchers are connecting that loss of Arctic sea ice extent to the extreme wildfires that are happening all over the world, the loss of Arctic sea ice extent is having a dramatic impact on the Alaska Native communities that are located along the west coast of Alaska. Arctic sea ice has traditionally been the natural barrier that has protected communities from the extreme weather events that we get in Alaska, not hurricanes yet, but we do get hurricane strength winds. And without that Arctic sea ice extent, the land is disappearing. So we worked with Alaska Native communities to identify another horrific environmental hazard caused by the climate crisis, and that is called Ushtek. It's a Yupik word, and it means catastrophic land collapse caused by the combination of erosion, thawing permafrost, and flooding. And many of you may have heard about the community of Nutok. I have talked about it a lot. They have been in the media a lot. They have done advocacy at all levels of government. That community of Yupik people, which is located on the western coast of Alaska, no roads connect that community to any other community. They are subsistence hunters and gatherers, and they have been advocating for their relocation to protect the safety of their community members for well over 20 years. And last year, finally, 1/3 of the people in the community were able to relocate to their relocation site, located about 12 kilometers across the Ninglik River. 2/3 of the community still are at their original location because there isn't the funding. And I need to say, I mean, I come from the United States where the assumption is, despite what's happening now at the national level, there is the capacity to handle this. And one of my messages is that in the United States, even with Barack Obama as president, we had no capacity to safely move this community. So 2/3 of the community are in their original location in dilapidated infrastructure. They lost electricity in August for a month, and there was no repair to their electricity. And that caused them to lose the foods they had gathered during their entire summer. And so now there is a food crisis in the community. And we still don't know when the 2/3 of the people who live at their original location will be able to be safe. And that has dramatic impacts, of course, on their culture and their ability to maintain connection with their entire community, because during this time of year, they can't travel back and forth across the river because it's in between freezing up and melting. So my recommendations today, I'm going to focus on the issue of planned relocation, because that's what the Alaska Native communities have been advocating for now, as I said, over 20 years. And we still do not have a governance framework that can protect the human rights of the people who are choosing this awful consequence to our climate crisis. So when I'm talking about planned relocation, I'm talking, first of all, it has to be voluntary, which means that the people who are going to need to relocate make all of the decisions about where, whether, when they relocate, because we all know the horrific legacies of government mandated forced relocations. In addition, this is a multi-year planning process. So this is not something that will happen in a year or two. It takes a long time to figure out where, how, and what the mechanism is going to be, so people can maintain their cultural and kinship connections and also their livelihoods. Because that's what we forget when we're talking about planned relocation. This isn't just about infrastructure, it's about people. And as the ambassador stated, people are deeply connected to the land where they have lived for millennia, and leaving that land causes tremendous grief and loss. And so it needs to be a multi-year planning process. And so the challenges, as I mentioned, We only have the history of government-mandated relocations, mostly funded by multilateral financial institutions. And we know that those relocations have harmed the people that are relocated. The other issue is most governments have no mechanism to manage the internal movement of their populations and have no desire to, because of this horrific legacy of forced relocations for either geopolitical motives or to build infrastructure. The other thing that is super important to understand, we continue to talk about slow onset in the context of a disaster, but it's not considered a disaster in any form of legislation. So when you think of disaster response, it's in response to an extreme weather event that has occurred, not sea level rise. So until we reframe this in regard to creating a disaster response to sea level rise, we should not be talking about sea level rise as a disaster, because the world does not respond to sea level rise and provide the resources necessary for communities to be able to adapt and respond to sea level rise in the same way they do to a hurricane. And for that reason also, the guiding principles on internal displacement, clearly a critical document, but inadequate in this context. The guiding principles on internal displacement, when they refer to natural disasters, if you read that document and their recommendations, it's about providing food to people and providing housing and providing livelihoods, but not figuring out how communities will not need to rely on humanitarian assistance after the disaster occurs. So we need a different framework in order to address the fact that sea level rise in particular and erosions is going to cause land to permanently disappear. And for that reason, we need to figure out, take this issue of the climate crisis outside of conflict, because there are really different thresholds that will be met and exceeded that will determine whether and when people need to relocate. And then, of course, human rights need to be protected, and that right to self-determination is the most important human right to protect in order to avoid the awful consequences of relocations. And then finally, like increasing government capacity. Climate scientists need to be part of this discussion along with humanitarian actors. The issue of climate forced displacement cannot be taken outside of the context of what is happening in regard to the accelerating climate crises that are occurring because of this ongoing increase in greenhouse gas emissions. And then we have to, as I said, figure out a different way of defining disasters so that communities can get access to the resources that they need prior to them being displaced, and outside of the context of an extreme weather event, because it's only in the planning and true engagement with communities that they will be able to determine their future in a climate altered world, because the climate crisis is going to affect every part of the way that we all live. And people who are experiencing this now have tremendous knowledge and expertise that they need to be able to share. So when institutional frameworks are created within countries, climate affected populations have to be part of that conversation in determining what that institutional framework will look like so that it can guide the response of national governments. Thank you for this opportunity to present this information. And I'm hopeful that the General Assembly will take on this issue in the high-level panel in a way that protects the human rights of those who are currently affected by this crisis. Thank you.
Robin, thank you for passionate, concrete, and surgical, dare I say, recommendations. I think you will find echoes in the speakers that will follow. Thank you also for the sentence I wrote down. It isn't about infrastructure. It's about people that are committed to their land for millennia. And I think that message, the consistency of it and repeating it would never be enough. Thanks a lot again, Robin, for the passionate and clear recommendations. I would like to go back to another front of this issue, all the way to Chad. We have with us Ms. Sarah Pallesen, who is coordinating a network of protection responders called Protection Cluster in Chad, and has seen the complexity of where climate change, conflict, disasters, and socioeconomic challenges come together in one place. Sarah, please tell us a bit, contextualize Chad for us, for those who are hearing it for the first time. What are the type of protection challenges you see, and how this interlinkage between all these layers of challenges are exacerbated by climate change? Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, William, and good afternoon to everybody. Madame Special Rapporteur Cecilia, Jimenez, Your Excellencies, and distinguished panelists, I thank you on behalf of all the partners of the Protection Cluster in Chad for the opportunity to address you this afternoon on the important topic of internal displacement in the context of climate change. I wish to just say that the Protection Cluster very much welcomes the thematic report of the Special Rapporteur, which really speaks to the realities of over 3 million IDPs, returnees, and refugees in situations of prolonged forced displacement in the 4 countries of the Lake Chad Basin: Nigeria, Niger, Cameroon, and Chad. The recommendations that emanate from the report set out very clear priorities for addressing internal displacement in the context of climate change that we are currently integrating into the ongoing planning of the 2021 humanitarian program cycle. So to answer your question, William, I think it is very clear that if armed conflict between non-state armed groups and state actors is the main driver of displacement in the Lake Chad Basin, it's climate change resulting in the slow but progressive drying up of the Lake Chad that feeds around 38 million people that is at the root cause of insecurity in the region, as found by the NGO Climate Refugees. 2020 has seen a deepening of the crisis with an intensification of armed conflicts in the border areas connecting the 4 countries of the Lake Chad Basin. Between May and August of this year, the number of IDPs on the Chadian side has increased from around 236,000 to close to 300,000, 297,000 to be precise. This signifies an increase in 26% of newly displaced IDPs over just 4 months. Frequent attacks by non-state armed groups against civilians include killings, most often of men, abduction of men, women, boys, and girls, pillaging of belongings, assets, and livestock. According to the protection monitoring data, over 400 killings and kidnappings combined have been reported between January and September of this year, targeting civilian men in large majority. Security measures that have been put in place to combat extremist violence and prevent the transmission of COVID-19, we see are clearly restricting the protection space for civilians in the region, limiting their freedom of movement, driving food insecurity, malnutrition, and health emergencies. Most of the IDPs in the Lake Chad province are located inland in areas where they have no or limited access to infrastructure, basic social services, livelihood opportunities, clean water, increasing their dependence on humanitarian assistance and underscoring the need of strengthening the humanitarian development nexus. A total of 93% of IDPs, according to DTM data in the Lake Chad province, live in makeshift shelters that threaten their shelter, their safety and dignity. What we're also seeing is that with the scarcity of accessible fishing grounds and farming land, many and mainly men venture to the government declared red zones because parts of the Lake Chad province are active combat zones. And here they run the risk of arrest and in certain circumstances of being caught in crossfire or mistaken as armed group elements by local authorities. Every year, the rise of waters during the rainy season from June to October plays into the hands of militants who operate easily on the waters, which always translates into an increase in the number of reported protection incidents. This year, however, with restricted access and disruption of telephone lines, which are critical for ensuring the protection monitoring that is done, it has been very difficult to actually to monitor the situation, which in turn, of course, is favoring an environment of impunity. Women and children are disproportionately impacted by grave violations of their rights. Vulnerable households in IDP hosting sites are in majority comprised of female-headed households, and we see a clear link between the inability to meet basic needs of their families with a resort to coping mechanisms that include early marriage, survival sex, and increased risk of intimate partner violence and psychological abuse. Also, the long distances to water points and firewood, given that most of the IDPs are located inland, far away from the lake, means that women and girls are exposing themselves to harass, attacks, abduction, and other types of sexual and gender-based violence. And according to the GBV subcluster, 34 women were kidnapped by non-state armed groups between May and July of this year. Among the grave violations affecting children, family separation is one of them in the context of forced displacement. The Child Protection Cluster the Child Protection Subcluster in Chad has identified 777 unaccompanied and separated children between January and August of this year, and 31 children abducted by non-state armed groups. In addition, insufficient nutrition, limited or no access to education, impact cognitive development, emotional well-being, with long-lasting negative impacts for the children and the youth concerned, but very much also for the societies they are part of. This year, and this is a stark figure, over 3 million children countrywide have had their education disrupted, either due to heavy floods that have touched vast parts of the country, but also because of COVID-19 prevention measures. Now turning away from the Lake Chad Basin and towards the protection impacts of floods in other parts of the country, this year we've seen close to 275,000 persons that have been affected by heavy floods across the country, with devastating impacts on including loss of homes, livelihoods, the right to food, water, and sanitation, healthcare, education, and poverty. Many of these are being relocated, but we know from other contexts that have equally been touched by heavy rains, the impact on the protection of civilians has been lessened due to disaster mitigation, including the construction of dams, which again underscores the importance of investment in early warning, disaster risk management, preparedness, in collaboration with development actors, as highlighted in the Special Rapporteur's report. A prerequisite for effective and timely prevention and response is effective humanitarian coordination in support of government efforts. The IASC designated clusters, groups of humanitarian organizations, both UN and non-UN, in each of the main sectors of humanitarian action, so water, health, food security, education, and so on, have clear and mutually reinforcing responsibilities for coordination under the overall coordination of OCHA. Here in Chad, we've seen in recent weeks what can be achieved when agencies work together to support government efforts of ensuring security, dignity, and access to basic rights for persons forcibly displaced by disasters. Upon request of and under the leadership of the government, clusters in Chad have mobilized to provide shelter, food, basic household items to 96 households in N'Djamena impacted by heavy floods this year. The protection cluster has identified jointly with affected communities specific protection risks and mitigation strategies, facilitated jointly with OCHA training for municipal authorities on basic humanitarian principles and protection in the context of displacement, with a focus also on the responsibilities of the state for the post-displacement phase, and has worked with IOM to ensure that persons with disabilities are meaningfully identified in the profiling that's been done to facilitate the delivery of assistance, while also ensuring that protection is adequately mainstreamed across the response. And this means ensuring that due consideration is given to security, accessibility, meaningful participation across each sector in a joined up manner. I wish to finish with one last point, which is where clusters are activated upon request of governments, they must be adequately resourced, both in terms of human resources and operational capacity to function properly. While assistance in terms of shelter, food, nutrition, healthcare, basic household items, as mentioned by previous panelists, are essential in terms of saving lives, it is equally important to ensure that education, camp coordination, camp management, and protection, including child protection and prevention and response to gender-based violence, are adequately funded to prevent abuse, rights violations, and the psychological distress and sometimes trauma, which if left unattended, impacts negatively on people's capacity to rebuild their lives after displacement. And I wish to just finish with saying that often overlooked and underfunded is camp coordination and management, which is a critical entry point for ensuring that communities are meaningfully consulted, and that no one is left behind, with a view to supporting resilience and self-sufficiency during and after displacement. Once again, thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for this direct, clean description of how conflict, climate change, and rights interplay with each other, and the work that you're doing. I must say that we have about 30 clusters activated around the world, initially for conflict-related issues. 20 out of the 30 have a very strong dimension of climate impact that is interplaying with the conflict. So the work of our colleagues in Chad is very important and a good model. Now I would like to turn to our final speaker for today before taking some of the questions that are in the chat box for Cecilia and others to respond. Mr. George Okoth-Obbo is the head of the Secretariat of the UN Secretary General High-Level Panel on IDPs. And George has a long history and experience in this area, and has probably been to more towns and villages and camps on the front line of climate change than capitals and nice hotels. So George, from your viewpoint today, how is the panel working on displacement in the context of climate change? What are some of your findings, and what are the gaps or more areas that require to shed the light on in order to take some of the work forward? George, the floor is yours.
Yes, William, asante sana for both stewarding us in this discussion, and of course for your opening welcomes to all of us, including myself. I also voice the same appreciation, quite frankly, first and foremost to Cecilia. Cecilia has been a friend of this initiative from the very inception. Even in just the last 6 or so weeks, I think this is the third time that we are together on the screen in an effort like this, which incrementally benefits the work of the panel. But William, maybe if I can use that segue to try and give some feedbacks to the question that you have asked me in relation to the work of the panel. The first one is that the panel is at a point now where the work that is done over the last 8 months, which has included information gathering, understanding the priority issues that ultimately it will speak to, translating that into the essential analysis for its recommendations, and of course, making its recommendations. This is now shaping up. Now, where the event such as today's is really so critical is that Cecilia's report aligns very much with the work that the panel is doing in identifying what are the problematics in this area, the analysis, and what could be the potential conclusions. When I say it aligns very much with the state of the work on the landscape, I must also acknowledge that we received a massive input from PDD in particular. That is the risk you take when you mention one, because there were others as well. But I think we must mention this one. But to see that many of the recommendations, many of the analysis and the recommendations that are in Cecilia's report are reinforced very much from what we saw and read and have heard from PDD, is a very useful dynamic for the panel, because it affirms the analysis and the problematics that it has identified. So my first takeaway here that I need to confirm is that this is an incredible report. It will be extremely valuable for the work of the panel. The issues that are posed in here and dealt with in here are not too dissimilar, and in some respects are on all fours with what the panel is working on. But secondly, William, the report and this conversation really pronounces some of the dilemmas which at this point the panel has not yet resolved. And in the conversation that will follow, I'll be very happy to hear on some of these issues which we will roll up to the panel. One of those issues is primacy of optic. Which is the optic that the panel should dedicate itself in the limited time and the limited space it has to express itself on this issue? Because here, and I really listened to Robin quite a lot, along with Ambassador Kabua earlier on, because when you hear them talk, it pronounces the parts of Cecilia's report which highlight that we face not just a response crisis, but an existential crisis. If in the Arctic regions that Robin was talking about, up to, I think the figure, Robin, correct me, would be up to 4 million people who are not just at the risk of infrastructural collapse, but potentially an existential threat to their lives. If in the small island nations, up to 65 million people could lose one component of sovereignty on which we exist, i.e. Territory might disappear. If in the mountainous areas that are associated with some of the things that we have heard about, again from Robin, I mentioned that is 700 million people. What should the panel focus its attention on? Because we also heard from Joseph that the day-to-day issues are compelling. The humanitarian response is an imperative of our times. Cecilia herself, the greatest part of her report is about the human rights optic, which should be embedded across all responses, something that we have heard and read already from PDD's submission. So this issue of where the accent should be is really a key issue in the work of the panel right now. And again, I will be very happy to hear in the discussion that will follow. The third one, William, that arises from the discussion so far is what we heard from Ambassador Kabua in particular. And that is the imperative of implementation, of giving effect to all this breadth and depth of recommendations, that many of which I'm sure the panel will endorse or work with. But really, what is the one or two issues that are critical? How do we establish an accountability system that means that the issues, and there are many, but let me just go back to Ambassador Kabua, because the head of her nation at the United Nations last year also emphasized this global unity on many things, including financing, for example. What is the mechanism that can accountably result in implementation and realization of recommendations like those, or recommendations of ensuring that there is political action in terms of recognizing and running with these issues? The panel is also debating and considering this issue very much at stake. If you allow me, I'll finish with just two. The first of those two is that you mentioned my UNHCR career. I think in regard to internal displacement, when I was there, the tendency was to illuminate much more the aspect of this problematic that was rooted in violence and conflict. It is true that disasters, especially in more recent times, started to emerge, but I think there was still an inequality of accent. So the panel is very much dedicated to bringing up, let us call it, the state of knowledge and visibility and awareness of the impacts of natural disasters and climate change in the context of internal displacement. What is important about that, however, is to be very alive to the risk of thematic displacement. Because in political terms, it's much easier, especially when you are talking about responsibility to act, accountability to act, to converse around climate change and natural disasters than really about conflict and violence. So we have to find a way to ensure that there is evenness in the accent that is placed on these questions. And lastly, and part of the answer to my own question, or rather to the point that I've illuminated and where really we have reacted so well to the report by Cecilia, is the theme of interconnection, intersectoral connection between all these factors. We heard from Joseph when he was talking about floods, talking about violence, all these things come together. So I think as long as we have this optic at the level of causality through to responses, through to governments needing to act together, through to this being a whole of society dilemma and so forth, perhaps this is one of the ways to keep us in step. So as I will shut up now in the next 10 seconds, just to reiterate our pleasure at the report from Cecilia, to confirm that this will be a very, very important resource for the work of the panel, but that this is not the end. There are many questions, some of which that I've alluded to, and every one of the 180 people who are in this conversation, we will welcome very, very much your further ideas and contributions as the panel tries to resolve these issues and frame them in terms of its recommendations to the Secretary General. Back to you, William, and asante sana once again.
Karibu, thanks a lot, George, for this good overview. Now I will take from the floor 4 questions. One intervention from IFRC, because I would like to hear from Richard Blewett how the IFRC is looking at the issue of climate change and how the whole aspect of localization and working with local community is coming through the experience of the RED movement. That will be the first. So I'm giving you, Richard, a couple of seconds to get ready. Then I have a question from Anna Francis that will go to Robin, and then 2 last questions that will go to Cecilia. So let's get started with this interactive segment of this event with you, Richard. Richard, the floor is yours.
Great. Can you hear me?
Can you hear me? Loud and clear.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, great. Well, listen, thank you very much. What a fantastic and important session this is today. For the Red Cross, Red Crescent, the climate crisis is an existential crisis. Our strategy for the next decade with our 192 national societies places the climate crisis as our #1 priority. We are going to be vocal about mitigation, and we're going to be practical, working with communities to deal with adaptation and resilience, because it's like a juggernaut coming to at-risk communities all over the world. For us, some practical ideas that we have in play working on these questions. Firstly, climate and disaster laws at the national level, adjusting disaster laws to address the climate question so that you can be practical in providing protections and assistance with government involvement. So that's one area that we're very dedicated to believing is very practical and can make a difference. The second is the whole issue of early action and forecast-based financing. You know, the humanitarians, we respond far too late to crises and we mitigate them far too inadequately. And we probably, like I think Robin was saying, we misframe them from Alaska. We need to reframe into early action, forecast-based financing, strengthening preparedness, contingency planning, evacuation planning, better resilience strategies and plans. And there is a momentum on forecast-based financing and early action in the humanitarian community, but it needs to be scaled up and mainstreamed by governments. You know, one action we have that we promote is a risk that was launched by the Bangladesh Prime Minister at the Climate Summit, was a risk-informed early action partnership. 1 billion people better protected from disasters. And we need to stop saying natural disasters. Most of these disasters are climatic disasters now. They're not natural. It's a political agenda and we need to create momentum for it. The third area is, of course, durable solutions. We need to support practical durable solutions with communities at the center of action. We've done 20,000 vulnerability and capacity assessments with communities around the world in the last decade. And that type of mainstreaming of that effort so that voice and agency is really at the heart of addressing the displacement associated or the risks of displacement associated with climate, we believe is very important. And then lastly, you know, very, very striking for us on our work on the ground with our volunteers is the last mile. It needs to become the first mile. Somehow there's a lot of talk about people left behind, but there's so little action. And listening to the discussion, the points raised by the displaced colleague from South Sudan, I mean, how tragic to hear all of those inadequate gaps still in a system that's not effectively responding. And we would believe that, you know, we need to place much more agency and support to women's groups, local humanitarian responders, you know, again, the local actors, the local government. Too much of a humanitarian machinery and not enough agency and voice of the actors that are actually doing a lot of the frontline work on the ground. And I'll end it there.
Richard, how refreshing to hear someone saying, this is our #1 priority. It's this clarity and simplicity of such a statement is rare these days. So thanks a lot for the full intervention and for the clarity of thoughts. I have a challenge for you, Robin. There is a question and I need you to answer it in 1 minute before I hand over to an intervention and a question from NRC Nina Berkland. There is a question about the DRR laws. So can you talk about what it would look like to recognize sea level rise as a disaster in disaster risk reduction laws? Over to you, Robin.
Yes, well, that's why climate scientists need to be involved in this conversation. You cannot define sea level rise in the context of a disaster without engaging with climate scientists who can help define the point in time in which land becomes uninhabitable. And that's why we worked with Alaska Native communities to identify Ustek, which is caused by this combination of environmental hazards, to identify that point in time when land becomes uninhabitable. So my response is engage with climate scientists in specific ecosystem regions, right? To be able to identify that point in time when a disaster needs to be declared and resources provided.
Thank you very much, Robin, for the answer and the conciseness of it. Now I would like to turn to the Norwegian Refugee Council, that is one of the leading players on the humanitarian sphere that has been driving the agenda of climate-induced displacement. Nina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, William, and thank you all panelists, and not the least Cecilia, for the report. I think this is extremely timely. I think for many of us who've been engaged on these issues around disaster, displacement and climate change, we have wanted to talk much more about slow onset, but we've kind of been often skirting it because it's complicated, it's more complex, and as Robin highlighted very clearly, a very clear call for us, as also the Excellency from the Marshall Islands. How do we deal with this when we don't necessarily have the legal basis for it? But I think what is important and what we've seen in a lot of the work we've done on policy related to disaster displacement is that don't let us stop that we don't have the formal laws or legal systems in place. We need to work on that, but at the same time, we need to make action. And I think what we've seen so clearly in the call today, that these are things we need to act on now, even though we don't have all the information, all the necessary data. It was said from IFRC that this is the first top priority. I think when we look at this, what we really need to make sure is that we insert these issues into all the various processes and agendas ongoing, because I think that's the only way we can make things happen now and not wait for having the proper system in place and the proper legal system in place to deal with it. I'm not saying we shouldn't work on it, but let's insert it. One piece of work that we have done over the last few years together with several other NGOs, states, PDD, Unitarian, etc., is on trying to get disaster risk reduction agencies to include displacement in their practice and policies. This is still work very much at the beginning, but what we have seen is that people who work from the disaster risk reduction are very keen to integrate this in their work. And in some ways, it's kind of kicking open an unlocked door, but still to make the group of people being displaced, internally displaced, visible, I think will make some changes in the future for these people. I'm not going to say we should take much honor for that as one organization. It's really one piece of the big puzzle. But on slow onset, even though there's many things we don't know, we know enough that this is happening. We've seen it and heard it also in this event. And how do we much more, both as humanitarian organizations and also working on rights, dare to step into this, even we don't have the clear definitions. So we are very encouraged about what we hear today. So how can we do this in our concrete work on the ground as an organization, but also in all the policy work on protection and human rights. So again, thank you so much, and we will try to support further.
Nina, thank you so much. I think I will borrow your message of we know enough, let's act, as another vote of confidence for your report, Cecilia, and a strong call from all panelists and the questions for you not only to present and disseminate this report, but keep up the pressure on all of us and on all the accountable parties to work on this important topic. I would like, before I hand over to Atle for some closing remarks, thank you for a wonderful set of interventions, very dynamic and diverse viewpoints. And on behalf of the Global Protection Cluster, we will continue our support both to the PDD and to the mandate of Cecilia. And with that, I hand over to you, Atle, to close the event. Atle, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, William. I do know that we are a bit short on time, but I wonder whether Cecilia, would you like to share with us some reflections on the discussion, and then you can take some minutes from my concluding remarks. But that's up to you.
Thank you so much, Atle. Again, thank you very much to everybody involved in this and the super organizers behind the holding of this event. Very, very quickly, so much have been said, and it's really time for us to give this serious attention. And one of the optics, as George has actually pointed out, that I would like to insist on is really the integration between the obligations of UN member states to protect their people and promote human rights with IDP participation in decisions that affect them. I think that these two approaches are indispensable together. And you know, my first report to the General Assembly was on the participation of internally displaced persons on decisions affecting them. This is still so short in many ways. While we give attention to international obligations of the states, we need to ensure the IDP participation is actually part and parcel of the response and as well solutions. So I'll stop there because we are running out of time. Much more need to be said. But yes, there's so much work to be done, continuous work, but it's not just up to me, it's up to all of us together. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Cecilia, and thank you to you, William, for steering us through this, and to all the panelists. I also want to recognize all our partners for this event. We have worked very closely with the mandate of the Special Rapporteur, with Natalia in particular, and we're very pleased with the outcome. I have 6 very quick points. I just want to run through them. I was jotting them down as we went along. And my first point is that the situation is real around climate change. We do see real impact, and climate change is nothing that is for the future. It's here today, and we need to start to mitigate it and address it. We also have seen that the impact is all over the world, from the Pacific to Alaska to Africa. So we really need to act on that recognition of that reality. The second point I take from this is the fantastic tool we have by human rights standards. So we can use human rights as a tool in our work. We have heard that human rights have underpinned policies in the Pacific. We heard from the ambassador of Fiji that their planned relocation policy is supported by human rights standards. And it's also important that the moment we bring in the human rights standards, then it becomes also a matter of obligation and accountability. So that's why the tools at our disposal can be supported by human rights, and we should use them throughout mitigation, adaptation, and response. Even mitigation should have human rights as its underpinning, for example, not displacing people through green project. The third discussion point I take is that we have seen different forms of implication on mobility. We heard about displacement, migration, and planned relocation. And these are complex social processes. There are people at the center of that. And it also suggests that we need to know more as these mobility patterns are evolving and the human rights implication. And also science. Robin brought home to us the importance of also breaching science. So the climate change scientists also talk to, for example, social scientists around social processes. The fourth point I take is the whole of government approach, and also how do we make sure that paper and theory and policies actually translate into action on the ground. And that requires also, of course, funding and political and commitment. I take a fifth point, and I think that's very important what Robin brought, that we may need new framework, we may need new policies. The world is different today because of the adverse effect of climate change. So maybe we are running short. For example, the guiding principles, although we are all big fan of that protection tool, but maybe we need to move on and look into new tools and new frameworks. We are facing something relatively new. And my sixth point to you, Cecilia, I heard the word incredible report. Congratulations to you and your team. I think we all feel ownership to the report because of your consultative and participatory approach. So you have a lot of friends in this group and elsewhere that will help all of us to bring those recommendations forward. So thank you so much for your work on that and for the report. With that, it's been a pleasure to be part of this event. We ran a little over time, but I think we have done a great job, or at least William, you have moderated so many panelists, so much richness, and we managed to land quite okay, I would say. So with that, I say thank you very much to all the panelists, all the participants, the moderator, and Cecilia, and wish you good luck. Have a nice evening, nice afternoon, or nice morning, if that is the case.
Thank you
Thank
very
you all.
much.